This is a complimentary video to what I love in books. Of course, I also have to do what I dislike in books. And these things vary from things I'm just not really keen on, things I'm not really interested in, to things that I really actually dislike. And tastes change over time. These aren't set in stone. I may be interested in these things in the future. In fact, I kind of hope so for some of them. Right now, I'm not super interested in fantasy as a reader, and I think that's reflected in this list, but I think it's likely I'll probably go get back into it at some time in the future. So this is just a record of my taste right now. So firstly, I'm not that interested in quest or adventure fiction. Yeah, I don't know, this setup just doesn't spark my interest. I can totally see why people are into it, and I myself was into it when I was younger. In fact, there's a book I think is totally under the radar, which is The Book of Lies by James Maloney. He's an Australian author, and this is a sort of middle grade adventure work that I highly recommend. If you have a young person in your life who likes adventure fantasy books, get them this. It's so great. But I think I've just sort of moved on a bit in my reading, at least right now. Next is fighting and battle sequences. Even when I was reading more fantasy, I still wasn't really into these very much. And it can be fantastical battles, but it can also be like more modern, punching or guns or something. I'm just not that interested in fighting and battle sequences. It's obviously, unless something really important or dramatic happens to the plot in one of these sequences, I just don't really care. Next might be a bit of a shock, but it's the found family or the ragtag group of misfits trope, which obviously they're slightly different, but I think they often go together and they have a similar feeling and a similar use in stories. They all feel very similar to me. I feel like once I've read a few, I'm not that interested to read more. And I find it interesting that often these dislikes that I've listed, they have a counterpart in the things that I love, and this is obviously quite the flip side of my enjoyment of reading loneliness in books. So I'm not sure what that says about me, but we'll try not to read too much into it. Next is multi-generational sagas. Yeah, I just find these kind of exhausting, even just the idea of them, to be honest. Obviously, I think it's okay if, 2 or maybe even 3 different generations are kind of covered in a book, but once you're getting longer than that, I find it hard to get too invested in any one of the generations, and it just feels like a little bit of a shallower emotional investment for me. Next are books that follow one character for their entire life, like from very early childhood right onto death. Again, I think it's okay to meet a character at a couple different times of their lives. For example, I really enjoy Jane Eyre, and that has one section where she's a young child and one section where she's a young adult, and I think that works because one can inform the other and they can both be sort of peak periods of activity of a person's life, and I think that's fine, but to follow the entire life is just a bit much for me. Next are teenagers or coming of age type stories. I don't know why this has never really resonated with me, and it's not coming from a place of condescension, because even when I was a teenager myself, I didn't particularly get much out of these stories. They just feel, again, very samey. Like once I've read 1 or 2, they all feel very similar. And personally, I prefer reading about adults who are challenged and who change over time. I find that much more complex and a bit more dynamic. Next might be a bit of a shock, but it's dark academia. This genre or subgenre or tone, I don't know what we're calling it. I don't know, I'm just not interested. In high school, I've never really loved engaging with literature and art and history in an academic setting. I love learning about those things myself. Of course, obviously I love literature and I love learning about art and history, but I like doing that in my personal space where I can self-direct my learning. In an academic setting, I've always felt really constricted to only learn or write about exactly what the teacher wants me to learn and write about, and it just feels really suffocating for me. I think maybe my discomfort with these subjects in an academic setting in my real life just sort of leads to a disinterest in reading about them in fiction. And most dark academia revolves around literature, art, or history, you know, Shakespeare or the Greeks or whatever. You know, I feel like if there was dark academia revolving around STEM subjects, then maybe I'd be more interested. I don't know. Is there a dark academia about medicine? Like, I'm on board for that. Next is one that I'm almost a little bit embarrassed about, or at least sad about, and that is mythology. I mean, I know I just said I was interested in literature and art and history, and that's true, but mythology has been something that I've just never found interesting, you know, and all mythology, not just, you know, not just Greek mythology, but any mythology I find just so dull, both as, you know, fictional retellings and stories, and as like a non-fictional account of how mythology has played a role in history. I don't know why, I've just never been interested in it, and I feel like I'm missing out on such joy. Like, people get so much joy out of this, and I feel nothing. I wish I did. Next is books about books. I just don't really care for them, especially ones that really lean into, you know, the magic of reading and how amazing being a reader is. And it's just like, well, I don't want to read about the magic of reading. I want to experience the magic of reading, right? Like, I already think reading is great, and I want to experience that. I don't want to read about a character experiencing that. I don't know. I think my one exception to the whole no books about books thing is when it's sort of a satirical take. For example, many years ago now, I read How I Became a Famous Novelist, which is a very like humorous, satirical, dry novel, kind of skewering the publishing industry at the time. I actually really enjoyed it. I thought it was quite funny, although having said that, I haven't read it in many years, so maybe I feel differently now, but at the time I really enjoyed it. I think it's because satire has enough bite to sort of counteract the like saccharine, like, oh, isn't reading just amazing, that just feels so like pandering and honestly a bit boring. Like, I don't want to read about reading, I want to read. Next is celebrity or fame culture. At least in fiction, I'm not interested. I actually do think that celebrity culture and pop culture are interesting and important in non-fiction. You know, I've read a couple of biographies on famous people and the effect that their art has had, and how pop culture as a whole is sort of this mix of reflecting culture and then influencing culture. I actually think that's really interesting. But in fiction, I find it really hard to engage with because none of it actually happened, right? Like, I'm learning about the not real influence that this not real celebrity had, which is odd because obviously I can invest in other fiction that's entirely made up, so I'm not sure why this one feels different, but it does. And it kind of leads into the next one, which is when fiction is so heavily inspired by real life that I may as well just read about whatever happened in real life. And I do have a specific example in mind. It's Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I read this soon after it came out, and it was so obviously so heavily inspired by Fleetwood Mac that actually bothered me. Like, I'm a huge fan of Fleetwood Mac. One of those celebrity biographies I read was on Stevie Nicks, and so, you know, I knew a fair bit about the history of the band and all the, you know, drama that happened there, and it's really interesting. But when I was reading this book, it just kind of felt like Fleetwood Mac fan fiction. Like, I why should I bother reading this when I can just go and read about Fleetwood Mac? I don't know. Next is a disinterest in magical creatures, including zombies. And I know I said I enjoyed Severance earlier, which I did, but the quote-unquote zombies in that book, and you know, they're not traditional zombies, and traditional zombies do not interest me at all. All magical or paranormal creatures, they just don't really do anything for me. I would say maybe the one exception would be witches, but I don't know if they count as a magical creature. I don't know, they're just a person with powers. I don't know. I would also say that The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen is my favorite fairy tale, so I might pick up a book including mermaids. So yeah, mermaids and witches are kind of the exception to this, but everything else doesn't do anything for me. Next is when a character's beauty is presented as mundane. Now, I'm actually fine to read about like beautiful people being beautiful. That doesn't bother me. I'm also okay with reading about not beautiful people. That, that doesn't bother me either. But when someone is described as not being very beautiful, and then you get a description and they are clearly very beautiful person, it just really rubs me the wrong way. Elizabeth Gilbert has a great quote on this. She says, "I get frustrated as a female reader when an author tries to play it both ways with a heroine's appearance. I get irritated when an author says she was not a beautiful woman and then goes on to describe a woman who is objectively beautiful. Typical example, she was not a beautiful woman, but she did have thick auburn hair, clear green eyes, a lovely figure, and porcelain skin." Even our dear Jane Austen is guilty of playing this trick. Lizzie Bennet is a perfect example of a girl whom we are told is not a great beauty, but who is clearly a great beauty. Ditto Jo March. My feeling is, if you're going to claim that your character is not beautiful, then stick with it, commit to it. Otherwise, just go ahead and openly say she's gorgeous. Next is my just complete disinterest in the progression of writing as a form, or the progression of the form of writing. I don't care. There've been plenty of discussions on BookTube about what are literary prizes for, and many of them come down to, well, has this book progress the form of writing? And I'm like, I don't really care, most literary prizes don't really resonate with me for that reason. I'm okay with being that basic reader who wants new stories, but told in familiar forms, I suppose. Next, I dislike flowery language, and I've said this for many years, and I stand by it, because most examples of flowery language, when something is labelled that, I don't like it. But I'm also not super confident on the exact definition of flowery language. Sometimes I'll put a book down, I'll DNF it, I'll say, oh, it's not for me, it's got flowery language, and I'm almost not sure if that's accurate. Maybe it's not flowery language, maybe it's a different sort of language that isn't jiving with me, and maybe I'm just labeling every sort of language that I'm disliking as flowery language. I'm not sure. And yes, I do understand the irony of earlier saying that I don't really enjoy learning about literature in an academic setting, and then here I am saying I'm not really sure on how to describe writing very well. I get it. But even though I'm a little bit blurry on the exact, outline border of what flowery language is and isn't, I do know that what is very clearly flowery language, I don't tend to enjoy. Next is something that is a little bit more personal, but it's when there is excessive fat phobia or diet culture in a book. I really struggle with this. I've gone on a bit of a journey myself with confronting these issues and learning to not only accept my body but also fight for the rights of bodies that are larger than me. And obviously I don't really want any fat phobia or really any diet culture in a book, but I do acknowledge that because we are so saturated in diet culture, it's kind of hard to avoid these things entirely. And if there's, a line here or there in a book, I can manage it. But if the book is really hitting hard on fat phobia or really excessive talk of diet culture, it bothers me, and I tend to DNF those books. Next is something similar that, really upsets me and really angers me sometimes, and that is when disability is used as a plot device without giving any attention to the character of that person. No effort or personality or perspective is put into the person with a disability, and yet their disability is used to further the plot in some way. This is my main criticism with Miracle Creek by Angie Kim. I made a 50-minute video about that book, but it could basically be summed up in this point, is that the plot of that book revolves all around these kids with disabilities, and yet not a single one of them had any effort put into who they were as people, and it really bothers me. So yeah, a bit of a dreary note to end on, I'm afraid, but they are some of the things that I'm currently not very interested in or dislike in books. So thank you for watching.